So again, the theories we're looking at this week are departures from, let me go back, from the more, and when I say mainstream, I mean mainstream in academic philosophy and Western philosophy, the three theories we've covered so far. So remember that when we introduced this stuff, I said, look, some of these normative theories will take their point of departure from the what ought I do question and focus on trying to identify a standard that will distinguish between permissible, impermissible, and obligatory actions. Categorical imperative and the utility principle both give us a standard that does that. And some other theories will take their point of departure, character-based theories take their point of departure from the question, how ought I live, or what kind of person should I be? So when we're looking at care ethics and existentialism ethics this week, think about which question do they seem to be answering more. And then again, some key elements of moral principles that we've covered so far. They're obviously prescriptive, but something that I really want to emphasize about deontology and utilitarianism in particular is that they basically give us a little test to perform, right? Almost like a little algorithm, the universalizability test. Identify the maxim of the action, see if it can be conceived as a universal law. If it can be, then it's at least permissible to act on it and maybe obligatory. If it can't be, if it generates any kind of contradiction of will or a formal contradiction, then it's morally wrong to act on it. And utilitarianism, it's just, calculating units of pleasure and pain, right? And thinking about the future and what would cause more pain or pleasure for the most people. So again, gives us almost a little mathematical problem to work there to figure out the single right answer to all moral questions. So again, key elements of moral principles is, again, the prescriptivity and the normativity of them, but in particular, for the justice perspective, are, decision procedures, that little test, right? And whereas we saw virtue ethics doesn't really give us so much of a test, gives us more of a loose guide, right, for virtue and what to do. Universalizability was a key thing. Impartiality was an important thing. Had to be a public principle. It had to be applicable to real world problems. So that ways in which care ethics and existentialist ethics, which we'll look at on Thursday, depart is that they often reject universalizability and impartiality. They often also reject other aspects that were common among those three theories, like intrinsic values. So there's some key things that are departures for these next two theories. We might not even call them theories. Maybe we should call them more broadly moral philosophy rather than restrict theory for those algorithmic, more algorithmic decision procedures like in categorical imperative and the utility principle. Right? So again, we went over that universalizability test, right? And it helps identify, again, what our obligations are, what we're not supposed to do, right? And then the principle of utility, the more foreseeable consequences of goodness or happiness, pleasure, according to utilitarians, it's obligatory. And if it's the reverse of that, then it's impermissible. So again, we have a little calculation to perform. Care ethics is not going to be emphasizing a decision procedure like that. So that's one of the first big departures. So again, think of what elements that seem to be central to most moral theories are being rejected, and which of these two basic questions do they seem like they're trying to answer more than the other one as we go through these. So today, let's just look at care ethics and what I wanted to do. Actually, I think I need to. No, I started that. So here we'll look at the care versus justice debate. Deontology, utilitarianism, and even virtue ethics focused on justice. That's why they're examples, particularly deontology and utilitarianism, of the justice perspective in ethics. So the article kind of sets it up as if these are two mutually exclusive options and we got to pick. Right. So that thesis is the one that I'm going to provide some care ethicists that even challenge that basic dichotomy here. So sometimes I use a Family Guy example for this. Y'all read about Avatar And again, the kind of three ideas that were mentioned there were maternal work. It's really, we could call it parenting work for more of a neutral term there. Engrossment, which has a lot to do with empathy. And then buyer on love. Notice none of those were central ideas in deontology or utilitarianism. In fact, one of the things that seems to distinguish deontology and utilitarianism, in addition to that decision procedure, is that they understand social relationships. They conceive of our social relationships in a fairly abstract way. And in fact, they even understand morality in an abstract, objectivist, and universalist way. So when we talk about what ought I do, what kind of person should I be, we're inclined to think about that in terms of our own identities and our own desires, wants, and interests and projects. But that's a universal I that stands for anybody, right, in the traditional theories. What should anyone do given the murder at the door scenario or the trolley problem, right? Or as we'll see coming up here, the prisoner's dilemma, right? So they're abstract. What should anybody do? Deontology tells us to clear our moral reasoning of everything that is particular to ourselves to identify what's universal. So a contemporary version of deontology emphasizes this idea of the original position, where you're behind a veil of ignorance, where you don't know what gender you are, what socioeconomic status you are, what your religion is, what your individual psychological propensities are, and then asks us, behind that veil of ignorance, what kind of principles of justice would we come up with so it can't be rigged in favor of any person or group, right? It's a way of abstracting the particulars and looking for what's universal there. In utilitarianism, if I'm faced with the choice between saving my own mother, who I am partial to, versus 10 strangers, what am I obligated to do according to utilitarianism? 10 strangers, mom's got to go. My particular relationship with her does not get to figure into my moral reasoning at all. It's pretty abstract. So utilitarianism just conceives of human relationships in terms of, you're either and vice versa, you're either the potential victim or benefactor of the consequences of my action, and vice versa. Again, a fairly abstract way of understanding social relationships. The first thing that care ethics is going to do is it's going to reject the abstract understanding of social relationships in favor of concrete relationships like parent-child, nursing, doctor-patient, student-teacher, friend-to-friend, community member, clergy to parishioner, these sorts of things, right? Again, concrete relationships. So a lot of this, especially in the Anglophone world of moral philosophy, kind of takes its point of departure from psychology and Carol Gilligan's work. She was trained under Kohlberg, who was a well-known, in his own right, moral psychologist that was interested in morality, and who developed a theory of moral maturity or of moral development. Right? And then Gilligan identifies a problem with the way he developed his theory, right, and then offers an alternative. So a few quotes from Carol Gilligan here. First, here's that Kohlberg stages of moral development. And this is the highest level of development. Right? So again, think of our moral philosophies, right? Think of your own moral theories that we've covered so far. Think of your own moral experience, right? When you're a little kid, you're pretty much just worried about obedience and avoiding punishment from people, right? You usually don't even have good reasoning skills, but mommy doesn't like it when you punch a little brother. And so you get in trouble for that, and you want to avoid being in trouble, so you don't punch your little brother anymore. Then we move up from that to self-interest. So how is it that I can fulfill my wants and desires? And then from there, we develop a little bit further and begin to understand the importance of cooperation and interpersonal accord. You're working in a group project with each other. Everybody has to behave according to some certain norms in order to accomplish the project, right? Then beyond that, we start to recognize the practical importance of authority for maintaining social order. We develop further to a social contract position where it's, I did this, we agreed to this, I didn't do it, so I get punished, you didn't do it, so you get punished, they did do it, so they get rewarded. And then the highest level of development is universal principles like our categorical imperative or the principle of utility, right? So this is a psychological theory of moral maturity or moral development. But here's what Gilligan identifies as the problem with how Kohlberg developed his theory. This is not good social science. He developed that theory on a data set that only included males. So by now we all know that's bad social science, right? So here's what Gilligan says about that. She says, the moral judgments of women differ from those of men in the greater extent to which women's moral judgments are tied to feelings of empathy and compassion. Notice those are two ideas that have not popped up moral ideas that have not popped up so far, and are concerned with the resolution of real as opposed to hypothetical dilemmas. What kind of dilemmas have we looked at so far? Trolley problem, calculating utility 1 versus 5, murder at the door scenario. What does the utilitarian say about that? What does the categorical imperative say about that? How do I run the universalizability test? Right? However, and here's what she's pointing out as the mistake in social science here. However, as long as the categories by which development is assessed were derived from research on men, divergence from the masculine standard can be seen only as a failure of development. In other words, the data set is at least implicitly biased in favor of a male perspective. That means that anybody who deviates from that will be unfairly judged as immature morally or a failure, as she says, of development. So what she does is she starts looking at little boys and little girls and identifies this different perspective, the care perspective. So in a different voice of women lies the truth of an ethic of care, the tie between relationship and responsibility, and the origins of aggression and the failure of connection. So it's rooted around concrete relationships and empathy and compassion. So she goes on, my research suggests that men and women may speak different languages they assume are the same, using similar words to encode disparate experiences of self and social relationships, right? So Nell Noddings is a philosopher who who helped develop this approach to ethics. And here's a few passages out of one of her works to kind of help us flush some of this out. So again, think of deontology and utilitarianism. We've got those tests to perform, right? Identify the maxim. Can it be universalized? If it generates a contradiction, then it's wrong for me to act on it, right? So ethics has concentrated for the most part on moral reasoning. This emphasis gives ethics a contemporary mathematical appearance, but it also moves discussion beyond the sphere of actual human activity and the feeling that pervades that activity. That's why I mentioned the question, what ought I do? For philosophers, that's an abstract question. I is a universal placeholder. When we ask that question, we're probably more thinking about in terms of our own interest in goods, particular concrete individuals with identities, right? So that's what she's emphasizing here. The view to be expressed here is a feminine view. This does not imply that all women will accept it or that men will reject it. Indeed, there's no reason why men should not embrace it. It's feminine in the deep classical sense, rooted in receptivity, relatedness, and responsiveness. Receptivity, openness to others, relationships with others, and responding to others' vulnerabilities. Think of parent-child relationships, a healthy parent-child relationship, not like an abusive parent with a child, but like your ideal of what a good parent-child relationship would look like. Right? So it represents an alternative to present views, one that begins with the moral attitude or longing for goodness, not with moral reasoning. So in that respect, it is like virtue ethics, because virtue ethics was focused on dispositions and character traits, just not empathy, and wasn't so much, in fact, one of the criticisms of virtue ethics is that it doesn't give us a decision procedure to help with these dilemmas, right? So a bit of a similarity and a difference between virtue ethics and care ethics then. It may indeed be the case that such an approach is more typical of women than men, but that's an empirical question I shall not attempt to answer here. We got two theses here. The first one, let's just call it the different voice thesis. That's that there are two different moral voices, justice perspective and the care perspective, and they're mutually exclusive, right? So two perspectives and they're mutually exclusive. Then the gender difference thesis, that's the empirical question about whether the care perspective is really indicative of women's moral reasoning and justice is really indicative of masculine moral reasoning or not? There's the empirical question, right? So we got a conceptual question. Are they two distinct moral perspectives? And then an empirical psychological question, sociological question too, about whether those perspectives are indicative of different groups of people, right? Everybody with me so far? So the stuff that we're going to look at from here on out is going to challenge the conceptual dichotomy. So the relationship, so how should we understand relationships? We should take them as central to our ontology, our way of being. Ontology is the study of being, very closely related to metaphysics, sometimes used as a synonym for metaphysics. So notice those, your concrete relationships with stranger, friend, member of community, parent, teacher, those are very basic to how you understand yourself, right, in the world. You understand yourself as a LSU Tiger and not as a Crimson Tide fan, right? Different communities. For our purposes, relationship may be thought of as ordered pairs, generating some basic rule that describes the affective, the emotional, and subjective experience of its members. So that's like student, teacher, doctor, nurse, doctor, patient, right? Friend to friend, friend, stranger, member of same religious community, right? That sort of thing. So this suggests that the ethic to be developed is one of reciprocity, but our view of reciprocity will be different than the contract theorists. That's mostly a punitive model. So if you cheat, the contract was laid out in advance, there's a consequence for it, you get punished for cheating, right? A punitive model for breaking the contract. You would probably be upset if your parents viewed their relationship with you as a purely transactional contract. You'd probably think they're not really caring for you. Right. Instead, they just need you to take care of them when they're old and can't care for themselves, just the way that they did with you. But you think of that not as a merely transactional thing, right? You want them to also love you and care for your whole person, right? So again, reciprocity, but not a punitive contractual model of that obligation. So the focus of our attention will be on how to meet the other morally. How are we to engage with others? And ethical caring, the relationships in which we do meet the other morally, will be the universal heart of that ethic. So there's, again, it does have a universalist element to it, but we must establish a convincing and comprehensive picture of that caring at the outset. That's where her notion of engrossment comes in. So the idea of understanding the feelings of the vulnerable person, right? Being caught up with their well-being, not just, are you giving them what you owe them contractually. Right? So Beyer picks up on this. She's going to mention love. Again, a key idea that was not really central to any of the theories we looked at so far. Traditional theories focus on obligation. Right? Again, obligation, you can have a contractual model of that, a utilitarian or a deontic model of obligation. It's the basic idea is the things that we're all supposed to do if we're in the given circumstances, right? So one can look at the sorts of contributions women have made to moral philosophy. Such a look confirms, I think, Gilligan's findings. What one finds is a bit different tone and approach from the standard moral philosophy done by men, at least most of them are men. So she says, Beyer again says, I seem to hear a different voice from the standard moral philosopher's voice. I hear the voice Gilligan heard, made reflective and philosophical. And what women want is what they're providing in a moral theory, and she thinks it confirms Gilligan's thesis, but a caveat, right? One has to be careful here. Of course, not all important contributions to moral philosophy by women easily fall into Gilligan's stereotype or its philosophical extension. So right there at the end, she's pointing out this is not going to be a clear-cut kind of dichotomy. We're going to have a collapse of that dichotomy, at least in Beyer's view here. So what would be the suitable central question, principle, or concept to structure a moral theory to accommodate the moral insights women tend to have more readily than men, and the questions that concern them more? So again, what ought I do? What are my obligations? Or what kind of person should I be? Right? The answer is not just a person concerned with meeting your contractual obligations, but a caring and loving person. Right? That has to be, as she's going to point out, has to be connected to obligation. So she says, I hypothesize that women's theory expressive mainly of women's insights and concerns would be an ethics of love. And this hypothesis seems to be Gilligan's too. She's gone on from a different voice to write about the limitations of Freud's understanding of love and how women know it. And again, pointing out the collapse here. But presumably, women theorists will be enough like men to want their moral theory to be acceptable to all. So acceptable both to reflective women and to reflective men. So women theorists will need to connect their ethics of love, right, with the men's theorist, namely preoccupation, namely that of obligation. So again, not everything fits easily into the justice and care perspective. Aristotle's a little bit of one that doesn't fit easily. David Hume is another one that doesn't fit easily into that perspective, especially if we're wrapping the gender thesis in with it. So in concentrating on obligations rather than virtues, modern moral theorists, again, deontology, Kantianism, the kind of social contract moral theory that we'll look at in political philosophy next week, that emphasizes the idea that we're all bearers of obligations, right? So in taking as contractarians do the contractual obligations as a model of all obligations, they concentrate on a case where very minimal trust is put in the obligated person and considerable punitive power entrusted to the one whom the obligation is owed. If you don't abide by the student code of conduct with regard to academic activity, I get to punish you, right? That's the system. It's punitive, coercive then. But again, you probably wouldn't want to understand your relationship with your parents, especially as you start to get older, as a merely punitive model, right? Or as a contractual model of a human relationship. So this is an interesting case of the allocation of trust of various sorts, but it surely distorts our moral vision to surely distorts our moral vision to suppose that all obligations, let alone all morally pressured expectations we imposed on others, conform to that abnormally coercive model. So again, following up on a lot of that is Friedman. She's going to claim we need to demoralize the genders. So first, let's think about what moralizing the genders would be. Just in your own notes, draw a little line down the middle of one of your pages, and on one side write feminine, and write on the other side masculine. And think about some traits, some character traits, or some actions that would be valued, at least conventionally speaking, in different ways, even if they were, so like the same kind of attitude, but displayed by a woman versus a man, where those are valued differently. So I'll just give you an example of something that you could use here, or an example of the sort of thing I'm looking for. Think of like sexual activity. How are men usually viewed in our society if they have a lot of sexual partners? I'm sorry?
A player.
Yeah, they're a player, right? We expect that from men. You can go over here to Tigerland and watch that behavior any night you want, right? How do we tend as a society to view women who are sexually active? Yeah. Right? So same activity, but moralized differently based on gender, right? So that's what we mean by the moralization of gender. So just try and pick out a couple of your own examples there. Try to come up with a different one than the one I just gave you. Everybody got a couple down? Or moral stereotypes about men and women. Ideal, right? The list that you came up with, they got any of these? Or the same, probably. For example, if a man is an assertive leader, he's usually praised, but again, women, what are they called if they're assertive in the workplace? I'm sorry? Aggressive or a bitch, right? Bossy, instead of, a good leader, he's decisive, right? So this is what what she means by the moralization of genders, just in a sense of our conventional morality, not in terms of these moral theories. The worry is that the moral theories, like deontology and utilitarianism, have implicitly drawn these into their own theory, right? Whether it's the moral theories or the theory of moral development, right? So again, if you go to the movie theater and you're watching, y'all know that movie, The Notebook? Maybe it's too old. It's a little romantic novel. If there's a bunch of dudes crying in the movie theater, we look at that weird. But if a bunch of women are crying at The Notebook, they're like, oh, this is great, right? So they're emotional. Women are expected almost to be emotional, right? And men are expected to not be emotional, where even emotion is coded there. Because when we say emotional, we don't mean anger. We typically mean like sensitivity. Right, crying. So the name of her article was The Demoralization of the Genders. So back up a little bit. So to say that the genders are moralized is to say that specific moral ideas, values, virtues, and practices are culturally conceived as the special projects of domains of specific genders. There is a big issue, for example, in the court system, that some people think is unfair, that there's a default bias that when two people get divorced, that where are the kids going to go? With the mom, right? Because they're the nurturers, right? So the conceptions would determine which commitments and behaviors were to be considered normal, appropriate, and expected of each gender. Which commitments and behaviors were to be considered remarkable or heroic, and which commitments and behaviors were to be considered deviant, improper, outrageous, and intolerable. So again, there's our list. Probably have some similar ones on yours. So think about justice, treating no one as a mere means, maximizing overall utility. Justice, and some care ethicists have claimed that justice does not apply to these interpersonal relationships. And Friedman is wanting to push back against that. She says justice is relevant as a moral concept to close personal relationships among comparable moral persons in a second way as well. The trust and intimacy which characterize special relationships create special vulnerabilities to harm. Commonly recognized harms such as physical injury and sexual assault become more feasible, and special relationships in corrupt or abusive degenerate forms make possible certain uncommon emotional harms that it's not even possible to impose in impersonal, abstract relationships. Think of like sexual abuse among, like domestic violence, right? There's a special example of a special harm, or like parents that like lock their kids in cages, that kind of thing. Those are special harms, right? So when someone is harmed in a personal relationship, they're owed a certain kind of rectification of some sort, right? So the notion of justice emerges there. You probably had this experience yourself if you have brothers and sisters, particularly an old one. They let them get their driver's license at age X, and so they got to decide whether you get it at the same time or not, or if maybe there's some significant difference, like maybe you were not as mature as they were at that time to give them that thing, right? So they're getting both elements of care and justice there. So in light of those reflections, it seems both wise to consider the seeming dichotomy of care and justice and to question the moral adequacy of either orientation disassociated from the other. So again, she's arguing against the distinction there, which is more prominent than what you read today is more of a thorough and strict dichotomy, at least in the reading assignment for today. So our aim would be to advance beyond caring, that is beyond mere caring, disassociated from a concern for justice. In addition, we should do well to progress towards gender stereotypes, which assign distinct and different moral roles to men and women. Our goal should be a non-gendered, non-dichotomized moral framework in which all moral concerns could be expressed. So she says we might, with intentional irony, call that the demoralization of genders, right? So she's moving from like, here's the way we do things conventionally, but here's the problem with that convention and how to rectify it, right? So again, pushing back against the justice-care dichotomy. So thus, the perspectives that Gilligan called care and justice do not point towards substantive differences in interrelationship or commitment. Both orientations take account of relationships in some way. So there's where we're able to reject that aspect of care ethics as a dichotomy. And they both aim to avoid harms to others. So they're not mutually exclusive. They can be and should be, she thinks, reconciled and supplemented with one another. So the basic standpoint of care then is to worry about particular people. I don't worry about y'all as tuition payers. I worry about you as students with particular aims and interests, right? So moral androgyny, right? Is a maybe unexpected term there, but that's what she's getting. A truly gender neutral moral ideal rather than a gender. Right. So care ethics is placing care, nurturing, and particular social relationships front and center in ethics. Offers an alternative moral concept from what we've covered so far that wasn't included even in Aristotle's, even though he was a virtue ethicist, and care ethics is much more like virtue ethics than deontology or utilitarianism. But again, Aristotle's version emphasized justice. Care ethics emphasizes nurturing and compassion. So again, an alternative ethical ideal there. And then what you're going to be reading about next time is going to posit authenticity as the central moral value. And it's going to contrast, it is positively evaluated, so it's going to contrast authenticity with bad faith in Sartre's ethics. And again, it's going to depart from the theories that we've looked at so far. Each of the theories before the break presuppose some universal view of human nature. Existentialism is going to reject that. So we'll have to see how they're trying to build an ethics once they reject the idea that there's a universal human nature and what role authenticity, freedom, and then bad faith play in those things. All right, questions about anything we covered today?